Hey everybody, this is a fibromyalgia update for 2020. This is both for general public, people that have fibromyalgia, as well as for practitioners. I'm going to give you the sort of 10,000 foot view of a paper that I read that's really interesting. It's called 1 Year in Review 2020 Fibromyalgia. It's written by a number of rheumatologists throughout the world in hospitals and universities. They touched on a lot of interesting research from just the year of 2020 that gets us a little bit closer to understanding what's going on in fibromyalgia and then gives us some good treatment approaches to take. So, the first thing that this paper mentioned is that we really solidified even more in 2020 the idea of nosoplastic pain. Nosoplastic pain is basically alterations in pain perception when there's nothing in the periphery that would explain that pain. So there's not tissue injury, there's not damage, or there's nothing that can be seen that would explain what the patient's experiencing, but there is still pain. So we've uncovered even more that there's pain alterations in the brain and the way that the brain's perceiving the world, and we've gotten a little bit closer to understanding how that happens and why that is. The main thing that I find the most interesting from this paper is that there was research this year to really show that the immune system is a primary player in that nosoplastic pain. You've also probably heard, if you have fibro or if you've worked with it much as a practitioner, you've heard of central sensitization. You can just think of it as the same thing, basically. So from the immune system point of view, there's increased mast cell activity in the skin as well as the brain of patients with fibromyalgia. So this means that there's increased histamine in the brain. There's also other inflammatory, increased immune inflammatory markers like IL-6 and tumor necrosis factor and some other interleukins. It doesn't really matter what those specific ones are as much for what I'm talking about. What matters is they're inflammatory, and so what you have with fibromyalgia is neuroinflammation. So as a practitioner, start thinking when you have a fibromyalgia patient, think neuroinflammation, what can I do to calm down that neuroinflammation? If you're thinking neuroinflammation, thinking leaky blood-brain barrier, what can I do to help that? Maybe you're thinking the gut-brain axis. But that's a really big thing to understand, that there's this inflammation in the brain going on, there's increased mast cells. Those actually drive an increase in nociceptive output from the thalamus in the brain. That's really cool that we know that, because we can work with neuroinflammation. There's lots of therapeutics that we can do to address that and calm the fire. The other immune system component is autoimmunity. Anybody, again, who's worked with fibro patients much, or if you're a patient who has fibromyalgia, you probably know that there is commonly autoimmunity that goes hand in hand with fibromyalgia. Maybe one or maybe many autoimmune conditions. So again, there's basically this picture of immune dysregulation, immune system dysregulation. So even if you're not seeing an outright autoimmune condition like rheumatoid arthritis, one of the things they mention in this paper is maybe low-dose naltrexone. I think they just said naltrexone, but it would be low-dose naltrexone. Maybe that has some benefit. Maybe that's one of the ways that it could, is by, because we use that in autoimmune conditions to help modulate the immune system. Another thing that they mentioned that's very interesting to me is that there's increased Th1 activity of the immune system. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy is modulatory to the Th1 part of the immune system. So they mentioned in this paper that hyperbaric oxygen therapy actually could be helpful for fibromyalgia. There was some research that showed that it was. They mentioned it later in the paper for another reason, that they mentioned hyperbaric oxygen therapy. So that's really awesome to know. Another interesting piece that just some research that was done that just basically ties in this idea that there is an alteration in pain perception is there was a study where They took patients with fibromyalgia and they had them look at pictures of people in pain and pictures of people not in pain. And the fibromyalgia patients were not able to distinguish significantly between the pain and the non-pain. So essentially that shows that that there's an alteration in the pain perception, even if it's when they're viewing someone in pain. I thought that was very interesting. It's just another piece of evidence that this is largely a brain phenomenon going on. So from the treatment perspective, there was a positive research study using the medication memantine. This is a medication that is an antagonist to the NMDA receptors, the glutamate receptors in the brain. Remember, the glutamate is the excitatory part of the central nervous system. The GABA is the calming part of the central nervous system. So if you're antagonizing the NMDA receptor, you're slowing down or decreasing the glutamate activity. So, and what did they see with this? So when they used memantine, I can't remember the length of time, but they saw increased cognition, decreased depression, and decreased disease severity. So there was very positive results from using this medication. But the big question that they have is that a realistic pharmacologic therapy long term? And the reason that I find this awesome is because it had good results, and we know the mechanism of action well of that medication. So we can use that from a naturopathic or a functional perspective to support the GABA side of things and put the balance towards the calming side of things. And we can modulate the brain activity between the glutamate and the GABA system. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but as a practitioner, you probably know how to support the GABA side of things, and you probably have some ideas of modulating those two pathways. So that's really important, I think. And there was even a study on ozone therapy. It was autohemotherapy where the blood's pulled out, put through a machine. It's ozonated, and then it goes back into the body. And this was a really positive study. It was only 20 patients, but in the study, all 20 patients had improved sleep, improved mental alertness, decreased pain, decreased tender points, and they actually had increased serotonin levels in their blood. That's awesome. So ozone autohemotherapy is potentially a therapy to remember in the future. Or if you're already doing that, know that you might really be able to help fibromyalgia patients with that. So the big take home here is that, fibromyalgia patients get told all the time by practitioners that don't understand what's going on or they don't know what to do, that it's all in their head. And that's such a disservice to someone to invalidate their experience that way. This really appears to be a brain phenomenon. There are differences in the periphery that we see, but those don't seem to be driving the whole thing. And so if we can calm brain inflammation, and the gut is talked about a fair amount in this paper as well, but that wasn't like the big aha for me from this paper. But, calming neuroinflammation, supporting the GABA system, not feeding the glutamate system, so like avoiding MSG as like a dietary example, and then making sure to heal anything going on in the gut, because that's going to feed leaky blood-brain barrier and neuroinflammation. All right, that's all from me. I hope that you got something out of this. Leave me any comments, send me a direct message, and be well.